So anyhow, welcome. Thank you for coming. This is an opportunity to celebrate women. We have a whole month, the month of March, to celebrate, and women's history has been something we've talked about for many, many, many years before it became a reality that an entire month was dedicated to the history of those people who often were erased, ignored, and sometimes misrepresented that somebody else had done what a woman had done because, oh my goodness, how could someone so fragile have done such an amazing thing? So in 1995, we began dedicating one whole month to the history of women in our country. When you think about it, how do we honor people? Well, maybe we name a state, a city, a county, a street after someone. Maybe we name a building or a geographical thing like a mountain or a stream. We write plays, we write books, we make art of all kinds, including statues, and we put a representation of the people we honor on our postage and on our money. Well, most of you are well aware of the fact that money in America has been the purview of men, almost predominantly men. Paper currency has had two representations of women, sort of. Pocahontas in, 1860 was shown surrounded by a group of guys. And then the only woman to date who ever had a single picture was Martha Washington, and that was in the late 1800s. It wasn't until 1979 that women showed up on a coin. If you remember, in 1979, we had the Susan B. Anthony dollar, and because it had a whole lot of issues, it was the same size as a quarter, it didn't actually work with vending machines. It was only produced for 3 years, and then it was quietly retired. It took a long time for poor Susan B. Anthony to have any company. It was 2000 before Sacagawea was on the dollar coin, and Helen Keller, out of all the 50 states, only Alabama used a woman to represent their state with Helen Keller. So let's talk about that Susan B. Anthony coin. You know, it was the first, and it certainly was a long time coming. The National Organization of Women, the Congresswomen's Caucus, the National Women's Political Caucus, and the League of Women Voters all helped to promote it and get Congress to pass a resolution that we would be minting that coin. In fact, the League addressed in a letter to Walter Fauntroy, chairman of the subcommittee on historic preservation and coinage, the League believes that the time has come, long past coming, for the likeness of a prominent American woman to be placed on a denomination of U.S. currency. We believe strongly that the likeness should be that of an actual woman, not of an imaginary symbolic figure. So guess what? The League has been behind having representation on our currency for decades and decades. And now, the U.S. Mint has a new program that is attempting to somewhat balance out the gender inequity of the past. We have the American Woman Quarters Program. These are 5 of the quarters that are part of that program, and they're the ones that will be minted in 2024. This was sponsored as a bill brought forth by Barbara Lee of California. And she expressed the hope that the coins, as part of an ongoing effort to address a country that has not always lifted up women in terms of who they are and what they do, that there was so much that women have done in this country that people don't even know about, that people don't even recognize. Lee said, we have to get these stories out about these women by any means necessary. I mean on coins, currency, by statues, by memorials. And Lee said, a long enduring call for this update of the nation's imagery and honor the contributions of women on the U.S. currency has taken over 100 years. Isn't it interesting? 72-year fight to get the vote. And by the way, this was introduced in 2020, the 100th anniversary of that 19th Amendment. And, well, it didn't take place until 2022. Everything moves a little slowly. You had to get the design, you had to pick the women, you had a lot of background before the first of these women quarters was minted. Altogether, this will be from 2022 to 2025, 5 women each year, a total of 20 women. Isn't it wonderful that we finally have a whole program dedicated to just honoring women? Now, these women are on the reverse side, the reverse considered tails. This is I learned a new word, obverse. It means heads. And by law, it has got to be George Washington. And we've had George Washington on the quarter ever since any of us can remember. However, he faces the other direction. This one was designed by Laura Garden Fraser. She designed it to go on the 1932 coin that was to commemorate George Washington's 200th birthday. But there was a man at the mint who decided that a man's representation should be the one chosen. Thus, the other quarter that we have seen all of our lives facing left. So, who is this Laura Garden Fraser? She is the most prolific woman sculptor in the 20th century. She created a coin for the Alabama Centennial, that was a $50, and she became the first woman in America to design a coin. So, both the front and the back of these coins is honoring women in our history. I wanted to pass out, I have 2 coins here. The over side shows both versions of George Washington. The other side shows a woman, the kind of woman that we usually had, just any old person representing women in industry. That's part of the America Beautiful Places, the Lowell History Park in Massachusetts. The other one is Wilma, what's her name? Wilma, I can't even read it.
Flintstone.
Huh? Anyhow, the other side is one of the first printed or minted in 2022. Do you want to pass this out? So just pass it out and give you a chance to see the 2 sides side by side. And I am just thrilled that both sides of the coin are important for our history. You know, the women being honored in this program have lived remarkable, multifaceted lives. They've made significant contributions to our country, to the world. They've promoted the issues of women and so many fields that they represent. By honoring these pioneering women, the Mint continues to connect America through the coins, which are like small works of art in our pockets. You could say these tiny works of art honoring the most amazing women you have never heard of. Well, until now. Our first speaker is Nancy Vaughn.
The woman I'm speaking about tonight is the Reverend Dr. Polly Murray. She was a poet a writer, a civil rights activist, legal scholar, feminist, and Episcopal priest, all in one lifetime. Murray's success stemmed from passionate intolerance for injustice, lifelong dedication, and forging relationships with like-minded people and influential individuals like Eleanor Roosevelt, who cared about civil rights, and Betty Friedan, who cared about women's rights. Murray's work greatly influenced the civil rights movement and expanded legal protection for gender equality. She wrote the foundations of two of the most important social justice movements in the 20th century. Her argument for overturning the separate but equal law used by Thurgood Marshall in arguing for Brown versus education, and later Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited an article of Pauley's to convince the Supreme Court that equal protection clause also applies to women. Anna Pauline Murray was born in 1910, and she was shortly orphaned after that. In 1914, she went to live with her maternal Aunt Pauline, her namesake, in Durham, North Carolina, the Jim Crow South. She was influenced greatly by her Aunt Pauline, who was strict but let Polly make her own decisions. She taught her the value of education, and Polly taught herself to read at age 5. She left North Carolina to go to New York City to attend Hunter University, where she graduated in 1933 with a BA in English. Two events inspired her career in civil rights law. She was taking a bus from New York City to Durham, and the bus needed to change buses in Virginia. Pauli Murray and her friend wouldn't move. They were asked to move toward the back of the bus more, where the seats were broken, and so they refused. They were using Gandhi's principle of civil disobedience. They were arrested, jailed, tried, and the charge was disturbing the peace instead of breaking the segregation laws, so as not to give the Supreme Court a test case to use. The other event that made a huge impression on Polly was while she was working for the Workers' Defense League, they were representing a black sharecropper who worked for a white farmer. This is in the middle of the Depression. Odell Waller was the sharecropper, and he shot the white farmer in self-defense. But the all-white jury found him guilty of murder, and he was put to death in the electric chair. Murray entered Howard Law School in 1941. Her quotation is, quote, with a single-minded intention of destroying Jim Crow. She was the only woman in her class, and she coined the phrase Jane Crow because she used to be discriminated as a black, but not as a woman, and so she got a full vote of that. While at Howard, she was writing articles constantly, and she was writing letters to Eleanor Roosevelt. They had a 23-year friendship. And the two most important articles were, one, challenging the segregation in the military. Polly and fellow Howard students embraced civil disobedience again, and they occupied, shut down, and desegregated a lunch counter in DC. And then the second article was her final law school paper, that school segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. She made a bet with her professor, Spotswood Robinson, that Plessy versus Ferguson would be overturned in 25 years. It was overruled in 10 years. Robinson was on the team with Thurgood Marshall in 1954, who used that paper successfully to argue Brown versus Board of Education, and which he did not credit Polly for. And she graduated at the top of her class in 1944. In 1948, women from the Methodist Church asked Polly to write an explanation of segregation laws in the United States. They thought they were going to get a pamphlet. They got a 700-page book entitled States' Laws on Race and Color that exposed the extent of American segregation. Thurgood Marshall of the ACLU called it the Bible of civil rights. She then went on to spend 4 years in a law firm, and in 1961 to 1965, she attended Yale Law School, and she was the first black to receive a Doctor of Juridical Science degree from the school. She then turned her attention to women's rights. She was very upset after women were not included in any meaningful way, either as speakers or meeting the president at the 1963 March on Washington. She met up with Betty Friedan, and they got together with some other women. And in June of 1966, they worked together to form the National Organization for Women. In the next 10 years, Murray focused on the women's movement, serving on President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women, which greatly influenced Murray's writing. When arguing Reed versus Reed in 1971, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited Murray's article, Jane Crow and the Law, which detailed the laws that restricted women and the parallels between the race and sex discrimination, one just as unconstitutional as the other. She wrote that she hated, quote, to be fragmented into a Negro at one time, a woman another, and a worker at another. She was a champion of all these rights, and Polly was also a forerunner of intersectionality, where people who are not being treated equally and fairly should band together. Polly then entered academia, and from 1968 to 1973, she was the professor of American Studies at Brandeis University. She taught law and introduced classes on African American studies and women's studies. It came as a shock to everyone when, having achieved the most stable and lucrative job of her life, Murray resigned and studied to become an Episcopal priest. She addressed this by saying that as she was fighting the battles for citizens, she was, quote, always more concerned with the moral and ethical issues contained within the political and legal issues. Thus, Polly came to realize that she had been doing ministry all along. Brandeis. Okay. At that time, the Episcopal Church did not ordain women. They voted to change that policy, and in 1977, Murray became the first Black woman to be vested as an Episcopal priest. A month later, she administered her first Eucharist in the Chapel of the Cross in North Carolina, where more than a century earlier, a priest had baptized her grandmother Cornelia, who was then still a baby and still a slave. Forward up. And next up is Alicia Keenan.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's give her a Hello, everyone. I'm going to speak about Patsy Takemoto Mink, and maybe you have also never heard of her before I started looking into her. Very, very interesting woman for sure. All right. So I want to start with a quote by Patsy Mink, who said, "It is easy enough to vote consistently with the majority, but it is often more important to be ahead of the majority. And this means being willing to cut the first furrow in the ground and stand alone for a while if necessary." That really encapsulates Patsy Mink's life and her outlook on her goals. Patsy Takemoto Mink's life was filled with firsts. She was the first Japanese American woman admitted to practice law in Hawaii. She was the first Asian American woman and first woman of color to be elected to be in the U.S. Congress, where she served for 24 years, from 1965 to 1977, and then again from 1990 to 2002 until her passing. Patsy Mink worked tirelessly for civil rights, women's rights, economic justice, civil liberties, peace, and the integrity of the democratic process. She was the author of Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in schools. On November 24,
All right, that's it.
On November 24, 2014, Barack Obama awarded Mink a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in this country. The quarter honoring her work and legacy will be released this year, and on the quarter, you can see her holding the Title IX document, and there's the quote, "Equal opportunity in education," which which is her motto. All right, so Patsy Matsu Takamoto was born on December 6, 1927 in Hawaii. And she started off with a bang. When she was a junior at Maui High School, she won her first election as class president, and she graduated in 1944 as a valedictorian. After graduation, she initially attended Wilson College in Pennsylvania and the University of Nebraska, but she had to transfer after facing racial discrimination. Students of color were not allowed to live in the same dormitories as white students. Now keep in mind that this was a time in which Japanese Americans were being held in internment camps, and so the bias of towards people of Japanese descent was very widespread in the United States, and she faced that consistently. She did not let this get her down though, and instead she moved to Honolulu to finish her schooling at the University of Hawaii with the goal of becoming a doctor. She graduated in 1948 with majors in zoology and chemistry, and then she applied to several medical schools to go on to become a doctor, and none of her applications were accepted. Instead, she pivoted again and applied to law schools and was accepted at the University of Chicago. That's what you call perseverance. She took every obstacle that was thrown in her way, and she just pivoted and ran with the next thing. At the University of Chicago, she met her husband, or not yet husband, but she met John Mink, that's her husband there, while playing bridge at the International House. They married and remained in Chicago until Patsy graduated from law school in 1951. The next year, the couple moved to Hawaii after having their daughter Gwendolyn, which you can also see there. Gwendolyn would grow up to become an author and advocate for women's issues herself. She also goes by Wendy Mink. While in Hawaii, Patsy Mink registered for the bar exam to practice law in the territory. However, after she passed the bar, Mink was unable to find a job because of her interracial marriage. So there was another obstacle thrown in her way. She started her own practice instead and founded the Oahu Young Democrats in 1954. She became the first Japanese American woman to practice law in her home state of Hawaii. Mink also worked as a private attorney for the House of Representatives in that territory, and then when Hawaii became a state in 1959, Mink immediately began campaigning to be elected as a congresswoman. Although her first attempt was unsuccessful, she won a seat in the Hawaii State Senate in 1962. She continued to campaign for a seat in the U.S. Congress even after the Democratic Party decided to support another candidate. But in 1964, a second position was created in the U.S. House of Representatives. With help of her husband and several volunteers, Mink won a seat in the House of Representatives, making her the first Asian American woman to serve in Congress. And like I said, where she served for 24 years, which is amazing. While she worked in Washington, D.C., she traveled back to Hawaii every other week. I don't know if you've ever been to Hawaii, it's really far. And she did that to make sure she was connected to the issues and concerns of the Hawaiian people whom she represented. She successfully served on many committees while in Congress and was able to voice the concerns of groups that were discriminated against, which in turn laid the groundwork for Title IX, which I will talk about momentarily. Here you see the Patsy T. Mink bronze sculpture by artist Holly Young. It's a little larger than life, and it was dedicated at the Hawaii State Public Library on December 6, 2018, which would have been Patsy Mink's 91st birthday. She's standing and speaking with arms outstretched to symbolize her love for the Hawaiian people and her engagement with that community. It's located in a seating area by the library where she used to sit and read to her daughter Wendy, which I thought was a nice little nod. Going on, recognized for her work, Mink was asked by the Oregon Democrats to run for U.S. State's president with the support of their party. This was in 1972, during which time the Vietnam War was still raging and was very controversial at that time. The party's focus was on the anti-war movement, and that attracted Mink. She decided to run for president. Unfortunately, she only received 2% of the vote, and that is the election in which Richard Nixon won. After this, excuse me, Mink remained active in politics, and in 1990 she was re-elected to Congress and served 6 terms in the House of Representatives. During this time, she formed the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. In August of 2002, Mink was hospitalized with pneumonia. A month later, she sadly died in Honolulu, Hawaii. Due to the upcoming election, her name was still on the ballot in November, and even though she had passed away, she won the election by a landslide. But, so she was very, very popular. And of course, since she had to be replaced, what are we seeing? Oh, there she is in action. So, to talk a little bit about Title IX, as a Congresswoman, Mink fought for gender and racial equality, affordable child care, and bilingual education. She was really big on bilingual education, by the way, and all of these things, but that was one of her pet projects. In 1972, she became one of the authors and sponsors of Title IX, the Title IX law that states no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Over the last half century, Title IX has had incredible impacts on the ways that society at large not only treats girls in education, but also approaches and condemns sexual harassment and violence, sexual violence more broadly. Shortly after her death, in 2002, Title IX was renamed the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. In 2022, the University of Hawaii and the state of Hawaii celebrated Mink and the 50th anniversary of Title IX, honoring Mink's profound and successful efforts to bring gender equity to education. A fitting tribute to an innovative, determined leader who changed the trajectory for girls and young women for generations to come. If you want to know more about Patsy Mink, there is a recently, in 2002, released biography about this fascinating woman. It is called Fast and Fearless, which in fact, she was. It was written by Judy Tsu Chun Wu and Patsy Mink's daughter, Gwendolyn Mink. So, thank you very much. Next, please welcome Richard Denton.
Hi. This quarter shows Mary Edwards Walker. Mary served as a surgeon for the Union Army in the Civil War and is the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor. She's shown here wearing the Medal of Honor and holding a surgeon's kit in her hand. And here's a blow-up of the Medal of Honor here. Mary Edwards Walker was born in Oswego, New York in 1832. Her parents were freethinkers and abolitionists who favored temperance and gender equality. They demonstrated non-traditional gender roles in their work on the farm, equally sharing in the work. Mary worked on the farm wearing men's clothes, which she found most comfortable. Mary's parents started the first free schoolhouse in Oswego so that their girls could get an education. Mary's father had medical books on anatomy and physiology, and Mary pored over them and became interested in medicine because of that. On the next slide, you can see Mary Edwards Walker on the left and a set of Civil War surgeon's tools on the right. So you see here a tourniquet, strap for a tourniquet, and a saw, and a bunch of very long knives. And it shows the limited options for surgery at that time. And I would be very wary of having a doctor treat me with just those tools today. After teaching in a school to raise money, Mary attended the Syracuse Medical College, where she graduated with honors as a medical doctor in 1855. She married a fellow medical student and they set up a joint practice. But the practice did not flourish because female physicians were not trusted at that time, and they later divorced on account of her husband's infidelity. At the start of the Civil War, Mary applied to join the Union Army as a surgeon, but she was rejected because she was a woman. So she volunteered her services and served as a surgeon near the Union front lines at the battles of Bull Run and Fredericksburg in Virginia and at Chickamauga in Georgia. And she always wore men's clothing during her work. In 1863, she was finally employed as a civilian surgeon by the Army of the Cumberland, becoming the first female surgeon employed by the U.S. Army. And then later she was appointed the assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. During her service, she frequently crossed the battle lines in order to treat civilians. And on one of these occasions, she was captured by the Confederate troops, accused of being a spy, and imprisoned in the notorious Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia. She suffered muscular atrophy while at the prison and was later awarded a disability pension as a result. After the war, President Andrew Johnson awarded the Medal of Honor to her for extraordinary heroism as a contract surgeon to the Union forces. Then Mary became a lecturer and writer, promoting healthcare, temperance, women's rights, and dress reform for women. She was a member of the Central Women's Suffrage Bureau in Washington, D.C., with the goal of getting the right to vote for women. Mary testified before Congress twice. She argued that a constitutional amendment was not required because women already had the right to vote, as evidenced by the fact that several states already allowed women to vote. Initially, the women's suffrage movement agreed with her that all that was needed is authorization or legislation from Congress. But after a number of years, without any results, the suffrage movement started to promote a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Mary opposed a constitutional amendment, and she gradually lost influence with the suffrage movement for that reason. Mary promoted what was called rational dress. She opposed long skirts and petticoats, corsets, and tight lacing. In the picture on the left, you can see her typical dress, which was a knee-length skirt over trousers. She was frequently ostracized because of her dress, and once she was briefly imprisoned in New Orleans. She told people, "I don't wear men's clothes, I wear my clothes." She wrote the following in her book, Unmasked. "It has long been my custom to classify the 4 leading curses of civilization thus: first, alcohol; second, tobacco; third, drugs; and fourth, fashion." But the more familiar the subject becomes, and the more I see of incurable cases, traceable to corsets and draggling skirts, meretricious headgear, and leg-beating flounces, the surer I come to reverse the order and place fashions and dress at the head of the horrid categories. No woman dressed fashionably can breathe or walk normally. The picture on the right shows Mary in her old age wearing a top hat. In her later years, Dr. Walker opened her home to those who were ostracized because of not conforming to traditional ideas of dress. And she was buried wearing a suit in Oswego in 1919. Oh, I see, I got it backwards. Now let me change to your slide.
Thank you. I am so excited to be able to introduce Zakala Saab, whose name in her native language means redbird. Born in 1876, can you hear me? Born in 1876 on a reservation, she was the daughter of Reaches for the Wind and a man by the name of Felker, who abandoned the family when she was just a small child. Zakala Saab lived her early life on the reservation, surrounded by the love and the protection of her mother, her aunts, and the tribe as a whole. She would remember those days as those days of happiness and freedom. However, that life changed drastically when she was 8 years old, as missionaries from the Whites Indian Labor Institute came to the reservation to recruit children. Well, Zakala Saab very much wanted to go to school, and she finally convinced her mother, who had severe reservations, to let her go. So off she went with several other children on the big iron horse, which took her hundreds of miles away to the school. Well, when she arrived, they got a welcome that they were not expecting. The children were told to strip of their buckskins, where their clothing was replaced by appropriate American clothes. They were spoken to only in English. They were forbidden to use their native traditions, and they were expected to worship as Quakers. But perhaps the most shocking event happened when the children learned that they were about to be shorn of their braids, because that, for Native Americans, was the ultimate insult. Zakala Saab responded by dashing off and hiding under a bed, only to be pulled out by her arms, tied down in a chair, where she had to suffer the ultimate disgrace. She later writes in her autobiography that that was the moment I lost my spirit. But her time at White's was really one of a love-hate relationship. She really was despaired at not being connected with her culture, but she loved learning to read, write, and play the violin. And those were talents that would make her the remarkable woman that she became. Well, after 3 years, she became homesick and decided that it was time to return to her native reservation and her mother. But you know, it didn't take long before she realized that she really didn't fit in there either. She was actually torn between two worlds. Well, when she got back to White's, because she decided to get her education, she then went on to study music and violin. She secured a scholarship at Earlham College and then got to study violin at the very prestigious Boston Conservatory of Music. Her next move was to Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where she was a teacher of music. And evidently she was quite talented, because her children were chosen to perform at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Zakala Saab herself was selected for a premier performance in front of President McKinley. Her greatest musical claim to fame, however, is her opera, the Sundance Opera, which she composed. She was the very first Native American to compose an opera, and its subject matter was an ancient tribal ritual, which, by the way, she composed on a violin. Well, back at Carlisle, she got very disgusted with the rigid curriculum and the attempt to brainwash the children. So she resigned, and she went to work on a reservation, where she met her husband-to-be and fellow Native American, Raymond T. Bonin. Well, Raymond was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and shortly after they married, they moved them to a Ute reservation in Utah. And it was that experience that opened her eyes to the very horrific conditions that Native Americans were living under on those reservations. But it was also time that she began her literary career. In the early days, she both translated and published stories about Native American legend and lore for children. She also wrote very compelling autobiographical narratives, and that's when you begin to see that tension that existed between her desire to assimilate, but her need for her traditions. Well, shortly in 1916, the family moved all the way to Washington, D.C. And that was where this amazing woman was the secretary of the Society for American Indians, and also the editor of their national magazine. And that marked the beginning of her life as a public individual. She began to focus on very explicit political writings, some of which exposed the brainwashing of Native American children. Others uncovered the corruption at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But the most explosive work was her work that uncovered the underhanded tactics that some American corporations were using to defraud Native American tribes of their oil-rich land. Well, that paid off, because down the road, Congress passed laws to protect those Native American lands, as well as to grant them autonomy over those lands. Well, when she moved to Washington, D.C., she became very active in the women's suffrage movement. She very much believed in the power of the vote for all Americans. So after women got the vote, she approached suffrage leaders and suggested that they join in to help secure citizenship for Native Americans. They, however, declined. But she made the same pitch to the Federation of Women's Clubs, and they took her up on the offer. And they sent her around the country speaking, writing, and advocating on behalf of Native American rights. Well, when she was back in D.C., she was also a very sought-after guest among prominent congressmen's wives who invited her to speak at their very elegant afternoon socials. And she showed up, clad in her buckskins, and she would regale those elegant ladies with tales of what was going on in the reservations. Now just imagine what kind of dinner conversations those women would have had with their congressman husbands when they came home that evening. And her efforts paid off, because in 1924, Congress passed the Citizenship Act, finally granting Native Americans citizenship, which also opened the door to the possibility of voting. Well, Zakalasa believed in dual citizenship, that American Native Indians should actually be citizens of both societies. They shouldn't have to choose. Unfortunately, some Western states passed Jim Crow-like laws, which really diluted the impact of that Citizenship Act. And that really angered her, and it prompted her to continue her advocacy until 1938. Now, her advocacy was not universally applauded. Some white Americans felt that she was very dismissive of the wonderful opportunities that she had been afforded at government expense. On the other hand, some Native Americans felt that she had abandoned them by seeking U.S. citizenship. She, however, remained true to herself, always believing that you did not have to give up one culture to embrace another. And her epitaph on her tombstone was meant as a lasting reminder of that belief. And it reads on the first line, Gertrude Simmons Bonin, her Americanized name, followed by Zakalasa of the Sioux Indian. And now what I'd like to do is to play a very short audio violin rendition. It'll come on. An audio rendition of a violin rendition of the Sundance Opera as she may have performed it herself. And with that, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Pat Drago.
There we go. Okay. You know, I want you to know that I'm a last-minute stand-in for Olga Hernandez, who could have addressed this. She had salsa dresses. She can trill her R's, but I'm going to do the best I can because this has been a journey to a different world. I'm going to speak about Celia Cruz, and you're going to see on that coin, azúcar, right? That means sugar. And she was very, very proud of her Cuban background. And so she would always point out that when you're from Cuba, you take sugar in your coffee. Azúcar. So that's what every performance, every song started with. Celia Cruz. Now I will tell you, I made a journey through a different world to me. Okay, I've lived in Miami for a short period of time when they first had our first influx of Cubans in the 60s. I have visited Havana, okay, and with the League, and I could see that music permeates the culture. But I have to say that as I studied about her, I found this is a world inhabited by millions of people and multiple hemispheres. And she is so well known, but she was not certainly a new name to me. Celia Cruz was born in a small village in Cuba, one of 14 children. Okay, pretty good. All right, she died in Fort Lee, New Jersey in 2003. So she was born in 1925, died in 2003, and the time in between is her legend, okay? Her full name was Ursula Hilaria Celia de la Caridad Cruz Alfonso. Her first pair of shoes were given to her by a tourist because she had sung, okay? So she sang and danced from her very early years with her siblings, etc., and on her streets. So, now let me see, her father wanted her to be a teacher. And she said years later in an interview that she had fulfilled his dreams because she had taught generations about music, her culture, and how to have happiness of living through music. I'm not going to...
Expedia, we'll track the price of your flight.
I don't know what that is, but that's okay. All right, we're always flexible. Azúcar. I think that what I found in learning about her was not years of hardship, okay? I did find years of joy and application in music. Okay, wait a second, Nancy. I got it. She attended and graduated from the National Conservatory of Music in Havana in 1947. So she was formally educated in music, okay? She ended up, her first break came when she was asked to join this band called La Sonora Montancera, okay, in 1950. This band traveled throughout the United States, Central America, and the Southern Hemisphere. They were as big as Duke Ellington in their day. So this was in the 50s, okay? She toured with this group for 15 years. Now, there were very few women in Latin music, and she was one, but highly successful. She married the band's trumpet player, Pedro Knight, in 1962, and they remained married throughout her career. He was her manager, okay? He then was her music conductor and arranger. So they had a long partnership in music. So the band was touring in Mexico in 1959 when Fidel Castro ousted Juan Batista, okay? And they decided not to come back. So they never were in Havana again. They were never in Cuba again. They then moved first to Hollywood, California, subsequently, and then to New York City, and they became U.S. citizens. So she had a fulfilling career with singing with various bands. She left Sonora Matancera in 1965 and joined Tito Puente. Now, Tito Puente was a name that I had heard, okay? And they released 8 albums, but still not really the financial commercial success. They didn't have a breakthrough there. Now, she did perform nightly at the Tropicana Club in New York City. You may have heard of it, okay? So she was fulfilled. She was able to do this. Then in 1974, she recorded a duo album with Johnny Pacheco. I had heard that name, called Cecilia and Johnny. Now, Johnny Pacheco was a trombone player, but he also co-owned La Fania Records. Has anybody heard of La Fania Records? No, I didn't. I'm telling you, this is a world of music and millions of people. What a world to inhabit. Well, Fania Records is widely known. They're based in New York, and they publish throughout the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere Latin music, okay? Celia Cruz reached her highest level of popularity when she appeared in the movie Mambo Kings. And I don't know, I remember that movie, okay, Mambo Kings, okay? Then she also sang a duet in the movie with David Byrne in the movie Something Wild in 1998. So she achieved acclaim throughout her career. Now, she continued to work and record and perform in 2002 until she was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Okay. At that point in time, then she went in and she had surgery, but she came back and performed for a major audience in 2003. That's how dedicated she was. During the course of her career, she won 10 Grammys. She was awarded a Smithsonian Lifetime Achievement Award. She has a Presidential National Medal of Arts. You know, all of these women were, to me, obscure until we learned more about them this evening. Celia Cruz has doctorates from Yale, honorary doctorates from Yale, and the University of Miami. A street in Miami is named in her honor, and the Smithsonian Institute even has an hour-long lesson plan on her life if you want to instruct about guaracha, which is the Cuban dance music. She was known as the Queen of Salsa. And I had this to go here. Olga Hernandez had purchased this, and my grandson saw it. He says, aha, you like Barbies. There is a Barbie, Celia Cruz. Now we're talking the height of fame here, okay? A Barbie, Celia Cruz. And in the Smithsonian is a model of her salsa dress, which is known orange, red, and white polka dots. So Celia Cruz is a fashion signature on music, and she just went her way with joy, with music. She had a partnership with her husband. I did not find mention of children, but she was able to tour the world, be successful as a woman, as a human being, and as a musician and dancer, and this is to her credit. And I want you to know, now we had a video and I knew it might be difficult, but I had a video that showed her receiving the Latin Grammy Award. And what was so palpable to me in watching the video, and I'm going to do something in a minute different, is that you could see the way, and I'm going to have her song here in a minute, but the way she was embraced by the audience, it was palpable, okay? The fellow musicians, and in the audience, watching it all, was her husband. And the camera would pan him and her, and then the musicians that came on stage to greet her. and then him again. So, and the audience. So she is loved, was loved. She had success. She did it on her terms, okay? And I think all of these women were fortunate and overcame, and we never can know what happens in every day. But we have a musical segment. This was her major song that you will recognize, and what I want you to hear is the particular flavor that she brings to it. Now I've lost It's going to be there in a minute. Thank you.
Wow. Let's have a big hand for our speakers. Linda and Jim, you might want to give her a hand, is passing out our handout, which